We are really fortunate to have two folks who know so much about the department join us today under difficult circumstances. It's been a hell of a news day already, as most of you know. There was a ruling out of Georgia that threw some ointment into things this morning. There are continuing churning of filings in New York in the Manhattan DA's case up there involving Trump. But it is kind of what we wanted to talk about today in terms of the Justice Department, especially with this panel. And Pierre Thomas will join us in a little bit. As I said, he's coming in from Miami, where there was a hearing down there yesterday. And how the department, for as big as it is and for as long as it's been around, and for people who've covered it, have covered various facets of this department, from the Civil Rights Division, the FBI, the ATF. Any one of those agencies can keep you busy for the entire life that you spend on the beat.
Right.
But in the past, well, since 2017, the beat has changed markedly, and even before that. And so it raises the question, how you cover a beat that is so now singularly focused. I mean, I shouldn't say singularly, because you have four prosecutions going on, not all Justice Department prosecutions, but four prosecutions that touch on aspects of the job that you would be doing at the Justice Department. So really fortunate to have both Devlin and Anthony here today to talk about, one, how this development, how this change has changed the job of reporting on the department, and how you're able to deal with that now. Devlin's an interesting example of this. If you read the Post today, you saw his byline on a front page story talking about what had happened in New York. And then inside, he's sharing a byline on what had happened in the hearing in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Were you in both places?
I was in neither.
How do you juggle those? Anthony, I think, would be great to talk about from the perspective that we kind of touched on in the morning, and that is...
Sorry. Sorry.
An appropriate theme. And that we touched on in the morning, in that how is the department managing this attention to the Trump administration against, and reconciling it against the agenda that they want to pursue, the priorities that an attorney general and an administration wants to pursue on criminal justice reform, prison reform, civil rights. And so there is a tension there that Sochi, I think, discussed a little bit today, but I thought these two could talk about it in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to turn it over to Devlin. Maybe you can start by talking about how in the world you're managing a job now that stretches you from New York to Florida.
Well, I think, judging by how late I was, I think the answer is clearly I'm handling it very badly. So I'll just do a little, very hopefully short spiel. Thank you for having me. I used to be one of you guys many years ago, sadly now, but I found it incredibly helpful when I first came to Washington, and I hope and certainly believe it is for you guys too, although I won't be one of the helpful people. I am not anyone to learn very much from. So how do you handle it? I have been covering Main Justice since 2008. Before that, I covered federal courts in New York for about 7 years, and NYPD for a few years, and so I basically only know how to do one thing, really. And one of the really odd parts about DOJ right now and federal law enforcement right now is it's never had as many reporters on it in my time. It's never had this many reporters on it, period. And paradoxically, the place has never been less covered than it is right now, because everyone is covering three things. Two of them are named Trump, one of them is named Biden, and we're all like pack hunting in that space. It's a very important story. I'm not saying like this is a terrible thing and woe unto democracy, but it does. I think it is. It worries me because to me it feels dangerously structurally imbalanced as a way to operate over the long run. To Kevin's point, I feel like this imbalance basically started in 2016, primarily the Clinton email investigation, which I could bore you to death about. You can look it up, it's on Wikipedia. But it is a genuinely, I think, difficult time in the sense of there's a lot of things the Justice Department does that are very important. Obviously, I believe that because I've been covering this stuff for a long time. But most of them aren't getting much external scrutiny the way they normally would in every other time I've done this, because everyone's trying to figure out like what's going to happen to Trump, what's going to happen to both the Bidens. And that's not good. It's understandable. I don't think there's an easy solution for it right this moment, but it's not a great dynamic. So it's very busy. I think I can give a different type of answer if you want to talk more about the meat and potatoes of how you do it, because there are some worthwhile points about the meat and potatoes. But like, the bottom line is very busy, very important, but also very one-dimensional. And that's a change.
Hi, everybody. I think it's the coolest beat in town, hands down. And this is somebody who I spent almost twice as much time at the Treasury Department during the Obama administration. I spent a lot of time, I'm not sure if there are any Hill reporters, Capitol Hill beat reporters here. I worked for 3 different senators. But I love this beat. I love this building so much because you can make whatever you want to make out of it. Like whatever you're interested in, it comes through and it touches the Justice Department. Devlin did a story about a year or so ago, maybe 15 months, right around Christmas of 2023 about fentanyl. Right?
God bless you for remembering that.
You remember this?
God bless you.
And so his broader point is right, is that there are 80%, 70% of what most of the DOJ beat reporters are in the categories that he mentioned. But occasionally, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, I'm not sure how this story came about, but I suspect it came about because it's something that you wanted to report out. As opposed to it being like a top-down type of assignment editor piece. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. There are so many things that DOJ touches that you can carve out your own niche. And this story, if you want to cry, this was one of the best stories I've read of Devlin's, and I started reading it when I was at the department, and I stopped reading it after like the first 2 or 3 minutes because you know how you feel yourself, like I cannot cry right now, right? But it was really a truly touching story, and I noticed an Associated Press person here. The AP has done incredible reporting about the Bureau of Prisons. Incredible reporting. I mean, the FBI just, we don't use the term raided. It was a court-authorized search. This is a hill I will die on.
You will die there. you will.
Court-authorized search. But court-authorized search at one of the prisons in Northern California. And Mike Balsamo, who is now an editor, and I forget the other person's name.
Maybe Mike Sisak.
Yeah,
Mike Sisak.
Yes, like that. I mean, they have owned this beat. And so, I mean, even though you all aren't assigned to the Justice Department, there are still things, if you care about it, there is a lot that you can do and cover, topics that you can cover that are undercovered right now that are so important to the public. Like, it's just there. Because nobody has the time and the resources. And I mean, the Washington Post has 3 beat reporters, right, at the Post right now alone. And they're still not covering everything that should be covered. And it's not just the Post, it's nobody is doing it. So the other thing I will say, I think another real opportunity for folks here, and I understand you all talk to Wynn and Dean and others earlier today, so much happens out in the country with various U.S. attorney offices. Those are, if there are issues, if there are areas of the country where you really want to know what's happening outside of D.C., you should talk to Wynn and get connected with some of the U.S. attorneys. Because, right, you want to talk about crime, for instance, right? Like, yes, you could do this from a DC angle here. You could go deep here, particularly because DC, I think, right now is an outlier in terms of violent crime in the country. But there is so much happening out in the States that you really can and I think should reach out to some of these U.S. attorneys because they can give you a different perspective based on what they're seeing on the ground and some of the cases they're bringing.
Okay, good. Good place to start questions because we really want to make this a conversation and wait until I get to you with a microphone so we can get it recorded. There you go.
Hi, my name is Aneri. I write for KFF Health News. My question may be more targeted towards Devlin, but just you've both touched on like there's so much that happens at DOJ outside of the few stories that are sort of sucking up all the oxygen. How did you pitch stories to your editors that are not those main ones that they want you on all the time, and what advice do you have in trying to pitch kind of all this other stuff that doesn't get covered when a lot of the focus is going to be on those big stories?
So it's different for me now than when I was younger. Now I'm an old cranky person and my bosses are a little afraid of me. And now I can often just present a finished product to my boss. And if I have enough confidence that I know how to execute a story, where like, so the fentanyl story, that was something that I cared a lot about. I felt like we weren't doing justice to what this issue looks like in the world. And I put feelers out, and I finally got the thing I wanted from those feelers maybe a full year after I first started asking around.
Really? It took a year to do that?
Well, it didn't. It's not like it took a year to do the reporting.
Yeah.
It took a year to have someone call me back and say, I think I have the kind of thing you are asking about, and I think these parents are actually like want to talk to you about it. Like you needed two things.
Yeah.
You needed a set of facts that were important and were representative,
right.
And you needed buy-in from people who are in a tremendous amount of pain.
Right.
And so, because I've done crime most of my life, I think I spent a lot of time thinking about victims, and so I was really looking for just the right victims. That sounds crass. That's not. It sounds crasser than I mean it, but it's really important if you want to tell the story well. Like if the family is just broken and can't even engage with you, it's harder to tell. It's much harder to tell their story.
The other thing, I'm going to jump in here as the esteemed Pierre Thomas comes in.
Fresh from Florida, ladies and gentlemen.
Great, Devlin Barrett.
Good to see you, sir. What he referenced but didn't explicitly say was the strength of his relationships. And both of these gentlemen have strong relationships that they developed over years that allow them to tell those type of stories.
And the other part I would just say, because again, it's different for me now as an old cranky reporter than it was as a young reporter. As a young reporter, what I did, I remember this was in my mind like a key part of how I started. I was covering the NYPD. I was the night NYPD cops reporter. And in that job, you're really just a grunt. You're just doing like 2-hour bites of reporting. That's all you get. And what I did on the side is I looked around at the other reporters who covered crime. And at that paper, there were a lot of them. So there wasn't like, it's not like no one was talking to the FBI. It's not like no one was talking to the NYPD. Those bases were covered. But what I realized pretty quick was that no one was talking to the ATF on a regular basis. So as like a 22-year-old, I just was like, I'm going to be the ATF guy. And a lot of those stories aren't that interesting. You're not necessarily getting on a front page or the top of the home page for anything. But two things happened. One, I got a decent relationship. I had some decent relationships with some number of people, so I got a bunch of decent, let's call them small stories. But also, when there was a big story, if a crime in particular is big enough, the ATF will be involved, and the ATF will know things. And you can call the ATF, and even if it's a bureau case, like someone at the ATF can tell you, actually, the gun was sold in Vermont 2 days ago.
Right.
And that's important and that's valuable, and no one else is doing that. So my only suggestion would be, when you're starting out especially, look around the newsroom and you can
Right.
tell what's not really being,
Right.
who's not being talked to. And they touch a lot of things, they probably touch a lot of things, especially in government, God, they probably touch a lot of things that your newsroom cares about. They just don't know how to get to
Right.
that person, to that story.
I mean, and I'm obviously coming in late to the conversation. Again, pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, one of our top bosses came into town and I was called into a meeting, so.
We're all late,
like,
Pierre.
you
Like,
know.
Anthony's the only one who showed up on
In
time.
order to maintain gainful employment, this was, this was something that had to be attended. But I would just say, at base, it's all about interpersonal relationships. You have to think of your job as about interpersonal relationships. And the one thing that's consistent, just listening to Devlin here, is, you know, when you're doing your basic beat reporting, if you're starting out on a beat, you know, always realize that no person that you're talking to is unimportant. And I find the main thing is consistency of talking to the person or the people on a regular basis, where they almost feel guilty about not, you know, getting back to you, because you're showing that you're committed to the work. And, you know, maybe it's just my upbringing. I've just found that the way you treat people over time really does matter.
Right.
And that can be the key. And you being the first phone call to the public affairs specialist makes, you know, or giving you a heads up that something's coming, and trust. That simple word of trust.
Right.
I mean, you know, when I talk to people, you know, in your experience level, you know, one of the things, you know, I try to emphasize these sort of basic tenets of trust and, you know, how you're communicating with people. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do is wash out of your system that people have to tell you anything. They don't. They really don't have to tell you anything. And the key is whether you can convince them that you're doing the job the right way, professionally and thoughtfully, and that will be one of the greatest things that you can do in terms of standing out in your profession. You know, why do they want to talk to you first? Why should they want to talk to you first? And you want it to be because they think you're smart, thoughtful, you want to get it right, and that you're committed to doing the job the best way every single day. And hopefully that complements what you guys have been saying earlier.
So that's how Pierre got the first TV interview we did with the Attorney General. Right, we wanted to.
Thanks for mentioning that, Anthony.
I said TV interview. These are the print people always, you know.
Bitter. We're bitter, petty little people. Bitter.
Right, but you know, we were looking for, this is in April of 2021, right?
Yep.
And we knew it was a time where we wanted to reintroduce the country to the Attorney General. And remember, I was talking about relationships. The Attorney General knew Pierre. And when you have somebody who respects the role of the free press, but you know, he's only done, we're in year 3 now, he's done literally 3 TV interviews, right? So he is not someone who's gonna spend a lot of time sitting down with reporters doing TV interviews. And so the very first one, we wanted it to be with someone whom he respected, who we knew he would ask tough questions, but do so in a way that also gave him a sense of comfort. And so we talked Pierre into flying to Oklahoma City.
Yep.
Right? And folks got to know, I don't think any of you are old enough to remember the Oklahoma City bombing. No, y'all are not, right? No. Okay. Well, it's one of the things you may have read about.
9/11, it was the biggest terrorist event in the history of
Right.
Yeah, and just one thing, very important point.
Yeah.
None of you tell me how old you were on 9/11. No one wants to
Don't do
hear
it.
that
Don't
crap.
tell us.
No one wants to hear that crap.
You know, 1 or 2 of them may not have been born. Yeah.
What did I just say to you?
Not born, I was 3, no. We're at a stage we don't want to hear. No.
So to wrap up this story, we wanted to go with someone that that the Attorney General respected and trusted, and we knew we would get tough questions but fair questions. And so that's why the first interview we did was with Pierre and with ABC News. And we actually had, it wasn't just about the Oklahoma City bombing. That's how people, people were reintroduced to Merrick Garland. He was the top DOJ official at the time, the PADAC, who was sent to Oklahoma City.
That's when I
and
first
he was
met him, actually.
overseeing that case. But this was also at a time when there was a lot of racial tension in the air. And we tacked on to that trip a stop by Tulsa. This was right around the 100th anniversary of the what was the massacre?
Wasn't it
Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
Black Wall Street. And so in this interview, it's really sacred space. The Attorney General talked about the same type of hatred that destroyed Black Wall Street 100 years ago. There were elements of that we also saw on January 6th. So like he made it relevant to the moment. But
And
that's
his family, he mentioned, his family coming
right.
in the Holocaust in terms of, how that affected him and why civil rights was such an important part. And interestingly, that came at a time when in our industry, particularly television, I would remember explaining to Anthony that we were morphing into multiple ways we would get that interview out. We did a portion of it on a Sunday, and some of that ran on Good Morning America's Sunday morning on the show this week. But we were able to get versions of the interview on Good Morning America, World News Tonight with David Muir, and some of our other platforms. And not to brag, but those happen to be the most watched morning show, the most watched show on all of television, which is sort of remarkable that the evening news most weeks with David Muir is the most watched thing of all the things you can watch on TV every single day. That show is the most watched thing. And the fact that Merrick was reintroduced on a variety of conversations, and one of the things I told Anthony, and hopefully felt that way before the interview, was that I like for the principals to speak in complete sentences so the public can hear how they think. These are consequential people making very important decisions, and I think it's important for the public to hear how they process information. How do they think about the things that they're making decisions on? And we were able to do that, and and also a version of the interview ran on this week. So it was like 5 different places running over a period of days where the AG was reintroduced to millions and millions of people. And so I say that to say this. When you hear an agency, or if you're covering a campaign and they have a point of view about what they're trying to accomplish, it's okay to listen, because your goals are not usually mutually exclusive, in terms of what they're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to accomplish. And what I mean by that is, what I'm trying to convey is information that people at home can latch on to, understand, and make decisions about in terms of their view of the world, or their view of a candidate, or their view of policy. And sometimes you end up having to negotiate what's the best way to get that done. Hence, going to Oklahoma City, when Anthony mentioned that, I said, it's much cheaper to just wait till it gets back, and we can do it on Pennsylvania
Out in the
Avenue,
country, baby. Real people.
And like, you work in companies that have budgets, but I was able to convince my boss. I said, look, I think Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma City is the right venue to have the conversation, and if that makes him more willing to be fulsome in his comments, then I was willing to do it.
Hi, my name's Mike Fasoli from the AP. My question for you is, talking about, you mentioned victims earlier, and how do you go about, I work in video, so Pierre, for you too, how do you go about covering a story that's related to the department, but crime, injustice, and speaking trying to get victims to talk to you about these things that you're covering, and especially on camera, which can be an added layer of anxiety for someone who's been wronged?
That's a great question, and I'll start if it's okay.
Yeah.
Look,
Sure.
it's interesting. My job as Chief Justice Correspondent is, obviously I cover the building, right? And FBI and DHS and all those different things. And so when there's a announcement that there's a special counsel investigating former President Trump or President Biden, that's a dominant big story that's going to lead the evening news, it's going to lead to morning shows, it's going to be on all our streaming services as well. But I also view part of the job is to look for stories that illustrate some of the issues that we're covering on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that I've made in my career a personal, professional job or goal is to cover gun violence. So I've done half an hour's Nightline specials on gun violence, which means getting out into the community, riding with the police, talking to community leaders, talking to victims. And you know, part of it is use the base of knowledge that you have as a way to get deeper into the story. A story that I did this past year that ran in early November is one I'm particularly proud of. It's called One Girl, One Bullet. And basically, having done so many stories about mass shootings and whatever, I wanted to do a story about what does it mean to be shot and survive. Because if you think about the coverage both in the print press and television or streaming, it's like there's a mass shooting, we go, we descend on it, and there's a couple stories about, you know, the people who died typically and what wonderful people they were. And you might get an interview with someone who was shot, but usually they're kind of recovering and the families are very protective of them. And I said, you know, I want people to understand that being shot is not like in the movies. That, you know, people see someone get shot on the screen and then next thing you know, they're up and out of the hospital in 2 days. And what we took weeks to find a person who would be willing to let us kind of chronicle her recovery time. And it turns out it was a 12-year-old girl who was in her bedroom sleeping and heard gunfire outside, and all of a sudden it was dozens of bullets came raining through her apartment and hit her in the abdomen, minding her own business. And so we chronicled the story of the moment she got shot, and we were able to find, for example, that the police department had body camera footage. They were the first to arrive at the scene. It was in North Carolina, which we liked because it wasn't some major big city. It was kind of a suburban area. And we were able to get the body camera footage of them arriving at the scene and finding her on the floor in the corner, to the ER doctors who operated on her. It turned out she died 3 or 4 times on the operating table. She had like 20 surgeries in the span of like several weeks. And it was months and months of recovery and multiple surgeries. And that was a story, again, born out of the data I've been able to accumulate over the years in terms of understanding what gun violence truly is, being a chronic, I call it a chronic epidemic. And also I was hell-bent on pushing past the notion that it's just people in urban places shooting each other. And that one of the reasons I was convinced that the country hasn't done much on gun violence is the notion that there's this perception it's just poor black and brown people shooting each other. When you really look at the data, there are just as many people in what I call domestic violence scenarios of all races and socioeconomic types. Like the businessman who comes home and kills his whole family. It happens way more often than you realize. So that's part of the job, is trying to peel back the layers of urban myth and get to reality. And you're right, those stories where you find the people, but it took us weeks of talking, but part of it, they understood that we knew what we were talking about. We had to convince the family that we would treat the story sensitively. Like, literally, a young lady was in her underwear when she was shot. So I made it a point, said, look, we're going to digitize the lower extremities of her body. You know, we're going to make sure that we do everything to be respectful of the fact that this young lady nearly died and somehow survived the story. So
Talking to victims, I do it a fair bit now. I used to do it a great deal when I was younger. I have a lot of strong, cranky old man, get off my lawn opinions about some of the ways that younger reporters do it and some of the way that younger reporters think about it, which I don't agree with. I think reporters often worry too much about the feelings of the people they're talking to, and I don't mean that as like, you should care about these people as humans. Like when you talk to someone, your face should convey how incredibly sorry you are that this happened to them. And I think there's the fundamental challenge in talking to victims is to do it well, I think, you need to slow down, but that's not what your business is. Your business is to get like 30 seconds of like the weepiest person on earth, you know, screaming, Billy, 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 and then like, you got your clip, you're done, you're gone. Like it's harder for TV. Like it's harder for TV to do good victim work than print because, you know, you got the machinery. God, when I started, you know, I would go to crime scenes and like each station had not just a guy with a giant camera, but like a boom guy. And then there's the reporter. And it's like, you put 10 of those people in some poor person's apartment and like, you look like a lunatic. You come across to human beings as in some ways the worst part of the entire process. I will say in my experience, and again, I do less of this now than I used to, in my experience, it is much easier to talk to victims' families who are poor than victims' families who are middle class or wealthy. In my experience, victims' families who are middle class and wealthy are really often, much more often offended and insulted by your presence because they don't need you. They don't need your questions to tell them how significant this loss is. And I have, in my experience, I find that poor people are often much more appreciative of the idea that you believe their loss is meaningful and you give their loss meaning.
Right.
I once covered, this will always be burned in my head, I once covered 12-year-old girl walking home in Queens, listening to headphones, semi-truck takes a turn, she doesn't hear it, he doesn't see her, just she's dead in a second. I don't even, it's not even that great a story, but I went out there and that family let a dozen very loud, aggressive, boisterous reporters into their apartment and talked to them for hours. And at the end of it, I worked at a tabloid. We had a big tabloid headline that said, you know, she never heard death coming. It was not a gentle headline. And that mom wrote me a letter, and I remember getting that letter that day and being like, oh God, this is it. This is the you're the worst person on earth letter. And that letter praised me effusively for being the only one who cared. And to this day, I cannot tell you why she thought that. I don't think it's true. And this is the other thing, the fentanyl story you talked about.
Yeah.
I bawled like a baby through every single interview I did in that story.
Right.
There were interviews I did where I would finish and like, I remember going into another room and just crying for a solid hour.
Right.
I think as I'm older, if this stuff affects me more, but I also think it's easier to be affected. Like I could cry in front of you right now and honestly, don't really care. It doesn't say anything about me. But I think when you're talking to victims, the most useful thing you can do is convey that you care. And most of that is with your face. Like there's no magic words. There's no like, oh, if we sit you in this chair, you know, you'll be comfortable. Like none of that. I personally, and I'm not being fair to the TV people, I personally don't think any of that stuff matters. But I think when you look at someone, you have to convey that you actually care. And you have to be willing to slow down. And you have to, even if slowing down means you don't get the thing that your boss sent you there to get. I remember, tabloid's a different world, but I remember talking to one victim's parent, and she was sad, I was sad, we were talking back and forth, but she wouldn't really talk to me. And it was a very competitive story, and you know, it was going to be on the national news, and my editor at the time was a good guy, but he was old school and very hardcore. And he said, go back and tell her you'll be fired if she doesn't talk to you. And I was like, sure. And I'm like, I went to get a cup of coffee. Like, I don't need it. And I was 22. Like, you know, sometimes I think you guys are all like have real jobs. I was like a copy boy being sent out to fires in Harlem. Like I was I think, but even at that level, you have to have some notion in your head of, I know what the right thing to do is. I have some guess as to how to do it, and if I fail, fine. Like, failure is not the worst outcome here. Being a jerk is the worst outcome.
You know, I don't know that I totally agree in terms of whether poor people or wealthy, you know, are more inviting. But what I will piggyback on and totally endorse is when you're doing interviews, whatever happens, do not lose your humanity. If you do that and react to people based on what you're seeing in the moment and be respectful, it generally will work out for you.
All right, Pierre, so a follow-up. I'm going to do the reporter thing. Why don't you think on race? Why do you have
I
a
didn't say
disagreement?
that.
Why do you
Oh,
have a
You
disagreement?
said poor.
I said poor.
Poor.
Why don't I think?
Yeah.
You know, it turns on the circumstance and the people. Like, there's some people that, as far as the media, who are rich, poor, or whatever, they're just suspicious of the media, right? And then you're going to see some rich people who are not suspicious, and you're going to see some poor people who are, and it depends on the situation. So I don't presume. That's the one thing I can tell you. I try to presume nothing when I walk into a situation.
That's a really good point. Can I just
Right.
add one thing to that? Because one of the things that always stands out to me, when I was a young reporter in Brooklyn, I was covering a serial rape case, and they caught the guy. It was one of the first DNA cases Brooklyn had ever did, and one of the women was a mom who spoke at his sentencing, and afterward, she came up to me and she's like, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And I was like, "Sure." And then she pulled me aside and she's like, I want you to come talk to me about this case." And I was like, "Okay, you know, we probably aren't going to write a ton about this. Like, you know, there's no celebrities, there's no whatever." And she's like, "I know, but it would help me out if you could come talk to me about this case." And I didn't really understand what was happening, but I'm sure. And she takes me to a side room, and her 12-year-old daughter is there. And she starts talking about her rape, and I realized pretty quickly that this person had raped her in front of her daughter in a project elevator. And his whole approach was he held a knife to the daughter and said, "Do what I want or I will stab your daughter." And so the daughter was trapped in the elevator watching this happen. And she brought her daughter with her to the sentencing. And she had a whole very clear notion in her mind that my daughter was there for the thing. My daughter has to see the entire process,
Right.
because my daughter is not going to get better necessarily, but her best chance at getting better is if she sees how the whole thing plays out. Don't hide, don't shirk, don't pull back from it. And I'm like a 23-year-old white guy who's had a pretty comfortable life, talking to a poor black woman in the projects who was raped in front of her daughter. And the daughter is there for the whole thing. And it was probably the worst interview I've done in my life, because everything I'm asking, I'm just thinking like, the daughter's hearing this, the daughter's hearing this. And at one point she stopped and she's like, "You gotta just ask. Like, we can't, it's not gonna work if you don't ask the questions. She's supposed to hear the questions."
And so, and what I'm saying is, in every situation, you're looking for consistency, right, of your reporting techniques, right? Not losing your humanity, and using everything at your disposal in every situation is what works. You know, when you walk into a situation, you immediately are looking at the people, you're looking at the circumstance, and you want to react to them based on the circumstance, with the goal of accomplishing the mission, which is to get the most interesting, compelling story. And I'll give you an example. One of the first stories I did that kind of got me on the map at the Washington Post. I was this young cub reporter at the Washington Post. I started when I was 24 years old. And I developed this knack of like getting stories under the front page. And they were like, "How's this young kid? He's, you know, from, you know, rural Virginia. His parents don't come from any kind of money. He's not from, you know, anything to speak of. How's this kid suddenly showing up at the Washington Post and getting stories on the front page?" And part of it was always looking at whatever circumstance and seeing the potential for stories, and looking at people as the gift of the story, if that makes any sense. So one of the first stories that they were like shocked. This is going to make you laugh. I wrote a story onto the front page about what life was like for commuters in Virginia. And it turns out it was a fascinating story about Prince William County, which is this county just south of Fairfax. And it was a story about this couple who had children who got up every morning at 5 a.m., prepared their kids breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then embarked upon getting in their vehicles and commuting into Washington. And their whole life was built around the fact that they had this commute. And so convincing these people to let me be in their house at 4:30 in the morning and watch them come into their kitchen and, stumbling around, pulling out the cereal, but it made the story, right? And so, again, just thinking the story through, thinking about the people, and you reminded me of a story I did about women who had been raped. I was crunching through data, crime data, and I saw that the Washington area had a massive increase in rape year-over-year statistics, and it was part of a 3 or 4 year trend. And I was like, how am I going to make this story not just a number story? And I sat down and I came up with a plan. I said, you know what, I'm going to reach out to rape support organizations. I'm going to tell them what story I'm doing, that I need victims, but I want to do it in a way where they will fully tell their stories and what it meant to them. And it turned out, after talking to these support groups, that I would do the interviews by phone, not in person. Mail, and it worked out beautifully. I got all these great interviews. The women were very forthcoming about the trauma of it and making clear that this was not sex of any sort, this was violence, pure violence, and how they were trying to sort of piece their lives together. But that was, again, born out of the notion of how do I make this comfortable
Right.
for the people that I want
Right.
to interview.
So I have a question for both of you all. And you and I talked about this when I was leaving Devlin. There is a sense, because there's so much death, there's so much violence at the Justice Department, and you all are reporting on it a lot. Like, how do you protect yourself and your mental health, right? And as you guys are thinking about that.
This is the thing where I'm going to have a very inappropriate answer. I think it is fine and good to feel pain and sympathy for people who are in pain. I worry that we are telling young reporters too often that you are experiencing trauma because you are talking to someone else about their trauma. I personally, I have covered a lot of stuff over the years, not as much as Pierre, but I think we've both been to more than one awful rodeo. And I will tell you, I don't love the idea of telling people you're being traumatized by talking to people who have endured real awful hardship.
I get that, but I'm going to push back on it a little bit.
Please do.
When I was at the Justice Department, I think about myself and the first real mass shooting we had when the Attorney General was there was the Atlanta spa shootings, where I'm not sure if you all remember that well. But that was maybe April of 2021, give or take, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after Merrick was sworn in. And I remember that shooting, 8 people died. And I remember feeling that shooting in a way that after I stayed at DOJ for 2 years, after, I can't remember what mass shooting it was, and I feel bad even saying that, right? Because there's so many mass shootings. But towards the end of my tenure, there was a mass shooting, and maybe 4 people, 5 people died.
Probably in Maine.
Maybe it was Maine.
Yeah.
I didn't feel that shooting the same way that I felt the one early in the Attorney General's. And I asked myself, what's wrong with me? Have I?
Wait till you get to our age.
Am I numb to death and violence? And you all have a job. We all had a job to do, right? I mean, we have to get out a message. We have to communicate what the FBI, what the ATF, what the Attorney General is doing, and you can't be subsumed with emotions. You have a job to do, but I didn't feel that, and that bothered me.
I'm going to give them a true experience that I've shared a couple times in similar settings, and it's not a story I enjoyed telling necessarily, but it's a true story. And before I say that, one of the reasons why I had such respect for Anthony in the job is that not only was he what I thought, very professional and thoughtful, but he's a real person, and you could see him thinking through the job he was trying to do, and I have great respect and admiration. So
Thank you, Tom.
I can say that publicly. I've told you that privately. But,
Thank you.
To answer his question, it's an ongoing process of processing, dealing with the things that you cover. The most pronounced one for me, and the reason I tell this story because I think you'll get it. So I was a young reporter just had come to ABC News, and I'd been at ABC News about 9 months and had not gone to New York to meet all the brass. The vice presidents of ABC News, the various components. I hadn't done that. I just got in ABC News, started working, doing what I needed to do, and someone said, yeah, you need to go to New York and meet some of the people who make decisions about your career down the road. So I happened to be in New York on September 10th of 2001. And there was a series of thunderstorms coming through the New York area, and we were supposed to come back on September 10th, and the bureau chief, her name is Robin Sproul, said, well, Pierre, we can go to LaGuardia and sit there and only to be told that our flight's canceled, or we can just go ahead and have my staff book us a nice hotel. Sometime we're in Midtown, let's have a nice dinner, and we'll leave sometime in the morning. So I'm sleeping, I get up around 8:30, I've showered, and all of a sudden my phone rings, and it's my wife. And she says, quote, did you see that plane hit the World Trade Center? I said, what are you talking about? And immediately I thought it was a prop plane, small prop plane, that somehow lost its way and hit. And then she said, no, a commercial airliner. Turn on the television and see video of the plane crashing in. So the next thing you know, I'm racing to get from the hotel to ABC News headquarters. Again, I'm based in Washington, just happened to be in New York when 9/11's going down. So next thing you know, I'm on the set with Peter Jennings. How many of you know who Peter Jennings is? He's one of the legendary.
I'm glad to see people raise their hands.
That's a great
That made me
sign.
feel as old.
I'm great now confidence in you going because he really was one of the best television journalists period of all time. And so suddenly we were in the midst of covering this humongous, horrible story. And there's one point we're on the set, and the first Trade Center comes tumbling down. And Peter, I'll never forget, just had the instinct, experience, or whatever, raised his hand to signal to everybody on the set to shut up, not to say a word, as the thing was falling to the ground. And if you recall, this huge chasm and cloud of smoke started flowing through the city of New York like something out of biblical times. It was incredible to watch, and and he let that just play out, where we were silent for about 2 or 3 minutes.
Wow.
And then to round out the story, because then we were running.
Go ahead. I want you to finish.
So we were in wall-to-wall coverage. There were no commercials on commercial television, the main networks, for about 4 or 5 days. So all you were seeing was continuous coverage, and I was a person who was a part of the coverage, hour after hour after hour. I think over 4 days I got 8 hours sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. At one point I called Ted Koppel Peter Jennings, and those were two of the biggest anchors in television at the time. And I kept saying Peter because I was just saying Peter's name over and over again. And finally Ted said on air, on Nightline, Pierre, I'm Ted. Thankfully, the viewers gave me a certain amount of grace as the Ted But the long and short of it, there was this moment when people first started showing up with pictures of their loved ones who they would never see again. And I was sitting on camera, and they said, Peter's coming to you in 30 seconds. So we have an IFB, that's how I'm communicating with the control room, and that's how they tell me he's about to ask me a question. I'm about to start crying my eyes out because I'm seeing these people showing up. Have you seen my daughter? Have you seen my son? And I'm about to just cry. And I literally just said, sucked it all in, because I said, I am not the story. The story is happening in the city that I'm covering. It's about these people, it's not about me. I'm not gonna cry on the air. I'm not gonna do it. And I was able to vacuum clean every bit of emotion I had in the moment and just do the story. Fast forward 3 months later. It's Christmas. It's Christmas Eve. And I'm sitting in the kitchen, and my wife had made pancakes, and we were, and suddenly ESPN did one of those year-in retrospective, the year in pictures, the year in video. And so I got to see the Sundays after 9/11 that I never got to see. People in the stands saluting as fighter jets went by, people crying in the stand. And all of a sudden, I just started weeping. I didn't even notice it at first. Tears were just flowing down my face. I was crying.
You had bottled it all up for so long.
I had bottled it all up, and then it just came rushing out.
Right.
And,
Don't do that.
And my wife walked into the room, and again, this was just a private moment. She said, "What's wrong? Something wrong with the pancakes?" And I said,
We need to talk about the pancakes.
I said, "Honey, I didn't give myself room to grieve."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the answer.
Well, what I love about this conversation is that the former president's name has not come up once in about 45 minutes. And this is what the Justice Department has been focused on. This is what these guys have been focused on. And Anthony's life as well, now in his new life. But what I think is really instructive about what we just heard is that you bring all of that experience, knowledge, the way you treat people in interviews to the justice beat or whatever beat that you cover, and you use that to your advantage in the best way that you can. But again, I think this is the second time that we've heard this, and maybe it was from the White House folks that we had in here. Don't leave your humanity at the door.
Right.
And I think that's the advice we're continuing to hear, and it's something in my own career was a huge piece of advice that I always try to follow. And all of these guys are great examples of that. So thank you very, very much.
As is Kevin.
As is Kevin.
I should say about Kevin, we had many encounters where we were walking into the room covering the same story, and didn't often get a chance to discuss the stories that we were covering, but just seeing him, knowing the grace and the expertise that he brought to every story, which is something I kind of counted on, and he's one of the reasons why I've been willing to stay in the justice kind of beat, even though I've had forays into many other things. It's always kind of home, and it's because of someone like him, and you're very lucky to have someone who's able to give you some thoughts and instruction. And I will say this about covering Trump.
You can stop right there. I'm good with it. No, I'm kidding.
Right.
Go.
Is that you just have to cover him fairly. I mean, as one who goes on the evening news or GMA and have Trump supporters just furious at me for having the audacity to cover January 6th and say, that actually happened. That video is real. That happened. And then also to get similar fury when I'm doing a story about Hunter Biden, like, how dare you? This is a false equivalency. Why are you even covering that story? And my only retort is, I'm going to apply the same set of principles every single time, every single story. like the Fannie Willis case. I'm not covering that case today, but that in part is a story about choices. It's a story about choices. Now, it doesn't impact the evidence necessarily, but the choices, you can't look at that story without covering that story, fairly, and you have to examine the choices that the prosecutor made, and her staff made. So.
Again, thank you guys so
Thanks,
much.
guys.
I know that we've probably overstayed our welcome with you, but thanks for all of your knowledge and explaining it to us in a wonderfully gracious way.
Thank you,
Thanks
sir.
so much.
Again, I apologize for being late, but you guys were a high priority for me. I made sure I got on a flight that got me home at 11 o'clock last night.
I also want to apologize for Pierre being late. Good to see you, man. How are you?